Hello.
Hello. Good morning.
Morning.
Morning, everyone.
How's everyone doing this week? I set up the bot on Slack, so I know some of you answered it, and I think all of you did. So that's going to be something we're going to do weekly as a report. And I know it says, "What did you do yesterday?" I guess that just means, "What did you do last week?" So just give an update, and then if that gives you sort of clears things up in your head as to where you're at, and then we can discuss them in the meeting here. So good. So I guess I'll open and ask if we want to go around, and if anyone has any thoughts or things that they're stuck on, or whatever, they can talk about it right now. So who wants to go first?
Yeah, and they can just be very brief updates. Don't have to be big presentations or anything.
I mean, I'm happy to go first. So it wasn't here last week, I guess. Got some catching up to do. I just this morning actually kind of realized that the whole idea behind my research has already been implemented by others, which is great, right?
Yeah.
So that means I can go look at their research and move forward, so I don't have to do it. So on the one hand, it's like, oh, I'm late to the party. And on the other hand, it's like, oh, great, good. I don't have to do that. I can do other things. That's pretty much my only update at the moment.
All right. Well, we'll get back to that in a minute.
Okay, good.
I would just say I relate many, many, many times over. Like I relate, and I think that's a good. It's part of the process, and the more you find out things like that, and the more you think, oh, I'll just say it's a good thing. It feels weird. It feels very uncomfortable, but it kind of means you're making progress in a strange way. So that's good.
Who wants to go next?
I can go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, going off of that, my entire experience with graduate school in philosophy was feeling late to the party. So I definitely know what you mean. So I was going to have a presentation for today, but I didn't actually get my notes into presentation format. But I still made a lot of progress on taking notes on this question I had of what the difference between digital and analog is, like digital representations versus analog representations. So I'm happy to talk more about that when the time comes. I don't have a presentation, but I have notes that I can do a screen share. I've also been using Obsidian, which I have enjoyed, so it could be a good chance to show notes in Obsidian also.
Yeah, why don't we do that after we finish this? And yeah,
For sure.
because I think that's good. I mean, I stress doing a presentation, but we can do we want to show the steps to that. So
Right, and I do want to give a proper presentation maybe next week. But yeah, otherwise I've been good. I was pretty busy the first half of the week with work, but yeah, I've been doing well.
good. All right, Samantha.
Okay, so this week, my first half of the week was kind of prioritized by my midterms for school, but in the second half of the week, I got to work on that personal paper I've spoken to you both about the artificial intelligence automating the healthcare jobs, and it started to help me put a little bit more of my research and focus for the project I'm doing for this internship about the understanding the empathy. So that helped me put a lot of my research into perspective, but I haven't actually had a lot of time to sit down with it this week. but I'm hoping next week I can finish that outline for you and get it to both of you so you can see it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sometimes we have to figure out when to do research, and it's but yeah, looking forward to the outline, and yeah, it's you're all doing well, I think.
Yes.
So yeah, back to Brian's point about research already having been done. Yeah, it's always a thing. Like, you look in the literature, and you see that you see things that are similar to your idea. Sometimes they're basically your idea, and it's a bummer because you had this great idea and it's kind of deflated. But that's not entirely the end of it. You can build upon that. I mean, you can for one thing, you can do something similar. It's not as impactful maybe, but it's something. The other thing is it actually helps you to find a new path. So, if you're working on something, you see someone did something very similar, take notes on that and what did they do and what did they do? What do you think they did right? What do you think they did wrong? So, just because someone puts a thing out in the literature, it doesn't mean that it's like reserved for them. It's actually better when you have papers that are similar to what you want to do, because it's like if you do one thing on your own, that's great, but it's so novel that you can't really ground truth anything. So you don't know if you're on the right track. If people are doing things that are similar to you, that's actually good in some ways because, it gives you kind of like a grounding for what you want to do. And you say, well, it's similar, and, I need to cite this, and I need to sort of maybe analyze it a bit and say, what did they do right and what did they do wrong? Maybe they did this 30 years ago when we didn't have the kind of computing power we do now. Or, maybe they did it in a different way and I'm doing it in this way. And, there's a reason why this is better or this is different. I mean, there are a lot of ways, I don't want to say sell, but it's definitely, if you're the first to the party, you can do a lot of things, but you may be wrong and it's hard to really validate it. But if you have papers out there that are similar, it's not a horrible thing. You don't want to basically do what they did. You want to break some new ground somewhere. So it's a time to shift your research a little bit, and figure out what they didn't do or what they did wrong or how it can be improved upon. So yeah, it's not the end of the world. It's just a matter of this is a big important part of research is like figuring out where your research fits, because this is why people write papers really. It's as Jesse likes to say, map out that landscape of things that are being studied. So, whether it's, consciousness or, people have approached consciousness from many different angles, but, people won't just like study consciousness by throwing a dart. They like to start maybe the most tractable place and then move from there. And so that's why you see if you look at a literature, say like consciousness, it's very closely tied to attention. It's tied to some other things like, internal models, things like that. And those are things that have already been studied in other areas. They've just been brought into that area. And so, but that doesn't mean they're always right. That just means that's a good starting point. And so people will build off of that. And so, even if people have done things in that area, it's not, it's not just theirs to own. Now, granted, if you get reviewed, people ask about certain pieces of work. Why didn't you cite X or Y? And then, of course, the reason you do that is because you want to ground your work in that area, in that field, figure out what's been done. And, it's a lot easier to make an argument for your work, in fact, if people have done things that are similar than if you're just doing something new.
Yeah, I have a few follow-up comments, but then I know. Do you want to? I guess I'll make my comments quick, and then we can go into next. Which maybe, did you want to do Amanda's, or do you want to do that next, or what did you want to do?
Yeah, we can do Amanda's next after. You can make some comments and then.
My quick comments are, hi, morning, are, one quote comes to my mind as something maybe not to live your life by, but to think about and understand in the context of this conversation. And it comes heavily from the publish or perish ethos or arena. And I think everybody here knows, but just to say publish or perish is basically the sense that when you get into a PhD program or do higher level research, particularly in academia, you have to churn out, constantly churning out these journal articles that are published, and particularly high impact journal articles in your field. You have to get into nature, you have to get into your field specific best pieces of best journals all the time. And if you don't, then you might not get your tenure. And if you don't get your tenure, then you don't get what you've been aiming for your whole career. And there's many stories about this process. So this advice comes a little bit from that. And so I don't suggest living your life by it, but I think it's really important to keep in mind. It's a great quote to just, when I first heard it, I was like, it makes sense. And over time, I'm like, yes, there's a lot of things that are affected by it. And the quote basically is, there are only 3 papers you should ever write or worth writing. And it's the first paper in a field, the best paper in a field of study or on a topic of study, or the last paper on a topic of study. Why is it those 3? And it has to do with novelty, it has to do with funding, it has to do with how it looks, it has to do with the publish or perish paradigm of, you know, what's going to make me stand out, or like duplicating other people's work. And I don't think it's important to do this all the time. I don't do this all the time, but it's really like it's something to think about, particularly when you're like in graduate school or in a level of really thinking about what you want to do to push some of your things forward. It's important to keep that in mind, but also like the negatives of the advice are sort of, it really, you know, there's a great meme, and there's an image of it, and you probably have seen it, come across variants of it, where it's like, you know, philosophers and scientists hundreds of years ago was like, oh, I must further my idea so I can better understand nature, and like this dramatic, you know, focus on understanding true reality and what comprises it. And it's like modern day scientists, oh, I must tweak my findings and fit them so that I can be published in Nature. And it's like this, you know, a lot of stuff gets fooled around and fiddled around. And this is part of research, part of the uglier, difficult, forever, like Neil deGrasse Tyson has done some interesting look at, like, how has research been funded, you know, historically over time, like by wars or emperors or other great needs. And so like there's a whole funding dilemma, and this kind of fits with that. So again, like the counter arguments to the advice of the first paper, the best paper, or the last paper. There's a lot of new things right now that are totally challenging that paradigm of writing really good blog posts. Like there's a new science foundation actually here in Boston that's like focused specifically on not getting in that process and doing it, in a sense it takes a little bit away from like basic fundamental research, and makes you want to fit certain narratives. So this is a whole conversation to have, but I just think that's a really cool thing to think about as you, or at least be aware of, because some people will live their life by the paradigm, like I said. One of my life experiences earlier in life was like someone who like, they didn't, I don't know if they told me that specifically, but like they basically only cared about that, and they were nice, but they really fit everything in that agenda, and that's good, but you know, it definitely shapes the environment. So this is a conversation to be continued into, like, if you ever want to have a professional development session about this, or even just like if you have meta questions about research, like how do I talk to my advisor about this, or how do I deal with funding? Like I think so if you mentioned about funding over the summer, or funding for next year, funding with Case and Kersey, upcoming, like those are great things to have as just, you know, we can easily drop 10, 20 minutes on that at any time in a discussion, or have a specific set of presentations. So just to, again, foreshadow and allude to those conversations. Anything you want to say, Bradley, or do you want to, if your man is ready for talking about where things are now, we can move to that?
I mean, that's it for now. I like this conversation about the different types of papers, you know, maybe people should write or people would want to write. We've talked about the field finding papers, which are different. And, you know, so there are a lot of different types of papers. Obviously, they're first papers. I don't know if they're last papers, but you know, that's, yeah. I guess that gets determined after the fact. And then, you know, there are other things that you can do. So there are a lot of ways to publish. And of course, I've been talking with some of you about some of these other artifacts that we can make that aren't like papers. I mean, that's kind of the last step. You know, we can make blog posts and presentations and pre-presentations and, you know, software code or documentation for software code. Some of you are, you know, that's something that you would do more. But the point is that the publication is maybe the last step to getting research out. And then, you know, that's something that's guided. It shouldn't be guided by, like, you know, although sometimes it is, it shouldn't be guided by, like, you know, the need for statistics or the need for, you know, adulation. It should be, you know, good research. And good research can be put out as blog posts as well as papers. So
I would even say there's a major trend away from, a lot of people are just done with this, and like even like some of the things that like Timnit Jabru and distributed AI research are moving away from that. A lot of my friends are really literally focusing on blog posts. Like, not saying it because we talk about blog posts, but like they're literally saying, I'm tired of the tedious process of writing papers that go through a tedious review process that maybe never really get. It's like the impact they have with really well-researched blog articles, get a lot of comments in specific communities, get so much more immediate traction and add to conversations now, or than one. Because sometimes papers take multiple years to even get reviewed as opposed to published. Like, we've been through that process here in the lab. Like, it can be many months from inception to an idea to research to collection, fleshing out, to making paper, reading it twice, getting rejected, reading it again, and then it's out in public. And that's why at least preprints are a shortcut for that. But a lot of people are literally not trying anymore and still doing great research. And so that's a major. You talk about frontiers in the future, and like what you like. If you care about research, do you have to be in the publish or perish paradigm? Absolutely not. So I digress, but it's a big major thing now.
So I see we have Sadena here and Cheyenne. So Sadena, would you like to give an update on what you've been up to the last week?
Just a brief, like, you know, how's it going?
Okay. Well, you could type it in the chat and we can read it.
Yeah. No pressure.
Cheyenne, did you have anything you'd like to mention? Any questions you had? As Sadena's working on her.
Yeah, hi everyone.
Hello.
So, yeah, I was going to the Gsoc project, and the first part is the thing which I'm currently searching on, like how to model the open source community, the reward mechanisms or the feedback thing. How is it to be done, and that's the thing. Apart from that, like the modeling part, I think we can cover up that because I'm still trying on my own to do the Flappy Bird one first, and then I have prior experience also of modeling agent-based models. So I think the second part is can be will be a bit easy for me, but the first part is the thing which I need to cover up.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. Thank you. Yeah, so the Gsoc project has, of course, two parts. It has the first part where you're modeling an open source community, and there are different ways you can do that. There's sort of a cybernetic approach where you're looking at boxes and arrows and feedbacks, and then there may be more rigorous approaches, or maybe just different approaches, which are things like reinforcement learning, where you have rewards and you have feedbacks, and it's handled in a little bit different way. The idea is to represent that community and represent what's going on in it, and then having that model, and then once you have that model, then you can train it with the agent-based modeling output. So you would run an agent-based model, you'd set it up, and I have a tutorial for agent-based modeling available for people who want to look at it. I might present it later on this spring. But it's basically a model where you have agents, the agents interact, and then you get data on their interactions, and then you can use that to train the first model, and then that would be the project. And it's one of the longer projects. So this year we're doing the 350-hour projects, which are longer. They give you more time to work, and it's nice, if you have one part that's easier to figure out, because then you don't have to spend a lot of time on that. But the agent-based modeling platform we're using is NetLogo, which is probably the best platform that exists, that you don't have to do a lot of home brewing on. They have simulations that are set up in there. They have libraries that are validated. They're published, and then you can make your own, of course. But there are a lot of different simulations for social systems and for other collective behavior systems. So it's a matter of choosing a model or making your own model in the agent-based world. And it doesn't have to be open source. It can be some different type of model, social interactions. And then you'd have to justify why that's okay. Maybe you modify that model a bit. And then you build the other model, which is say it's a reinforcement learning model. It doesn't have to be. But then that model would be trained with the agent-based model, and there'd be this sort of two model, back and forth. And then, once we have those in place, then, I don't know, maybe the next step after that, and it wouldn't be in the context of the Gsoc period, but it would be later, would be to build a hybrid model that would do this sort of thing. So this is we're trying to I've had this idea for a while. We've talked about it a bit. The idea is, if you have open source communities, what's the best way to facilitate good behaviors, sustainable behaviors, and really that's good for software, because a lot of open source software, as they have issues with, people maintaining them. That can lead to security deficiencies. That can lead to other kinds of things where, people are using modules, that they're not synchronized. So it helps a lot. There's a sort of an ethics, AI ethics kind of bent to it. And then there's also sort of a human-computer interaction bent, I guess. But the idea is to have those two models working together. And yeah. So
correct me if I'm wrong. So the first part will majorly involve to hypothesize the social relations. So for an example, if you take NeuroStars, so they have some reward mechanism if a new member joins in, and if we put some messages, they show up a notification to you. So it's sort of that we have to somehow take the social relations and hypothesize whether this will be an important factor in sustenance of that community, and then we have to model that and validate the results based upon that, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to do it, is to say what are the most, whenever you model something, of course, you're abstracting things out of the system. So the brain, a neural network is the brain. You're saying that the most important thing are the synapses the neurons and the connections between neurons that lead to the synapses. That's it. We don't care about, like, other types of cells in the brain. We don't care about the, anything else. So we're just taking those most important components. So that's what you're doing here. You're saying this open source community, the most important things we need to understand are like a reward mechanism and maybe some policies that, are different ways of interacting. And, and so there's a way to represent that problem that's, and it doesn't, you can choose whatever you think is important, but to have that, kind of laid out there is the key. And then you can then apply your model, like a reinforcement learning model would be like, you'd have to understand what you're actually modeling. And then that would be what it would look like. So it could be, it could be like mechanisms for regulating behavior, so it could be rules in the community, like community standards, or it could just be like interactions between people in the community, there could be automated systems that come into play. I mean, you'd have to define them and then say how they work, and then that would be like the descriptive part, and then put it in terms of, like, say, a reinforcement learning model or a box and arrows model, where you say, this is what this means, this is what that means, they're working like this, and then you have then to train that model, you would have data from the agent-based model, and it would go and validate what you're doing in the first model.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that update. And so Sadena typed out her answer here. Since last week, I haven't done too much because of midterms, but I was writing an abstract for another lab and got some advice on looking at articles and how to organize things in an efficient way to make way for new ideas. So I'm gathering the things I read so far, organized in one place, and also to make a mind map for myself to make connections between things. So it's Jessie. She's doing pretty well there. And then Jessie put in the... So what did you think, Jessie? Do you have anything to say about that?
Oh, I mean, about Sadena stuff, or the...
Yeah, yes. Well, either.
Art.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's good to hear, Sadena. I think, that's... I know the midterm time, and that's good. And I'm all for math as usual, so that's good. I continue to be... I keep talking about, I'm going to be able to demo or show you implementation of frontier maps in Obsidian. I think it's not quite there yet. So I was like, well, that'll be great. So I'm curious. I'm really curious to see how man is using Obsidian and what she thinks of it in a few moments potentially. And the last thing I'll quickly mention the article I posted. You don't have to look at it. It's not vital, but basically. We were talking about open source stuff becoming obsolete, and Erin isn't here this morning, but she's very into that. She would be presenting on that specifically at the New York Celebration of Women Computing event ahead. A little segment in our presentation about that. She actually is mentioned she's working on. We've had discussions about that. She's already started writing, making progress on a presentation about that. So it's cool. The article I posted basically is, a company help people with it's kind of very cyberpunk, slightly dystopian. But like, my enhancement in implants and augmentations to my body, they're going great, but then they're no longer supported. Their updates are no longer supported, and then it's like you have this change to your body, and it's not supported anymore. That's is that going to become a thing of more common as we go by and have a more enhanced, more and more digital hybrid augmented existence? And this is a segue into something we could talk about after Amanda's talk, but there's been a number of submissions. Actually, do you have any really quickly, wait, I guess Bradly didn't say anything, but we'll say more later, but any really quick updates that you want to say, Bradly, or just wait until all our stuff later?
Oh, we can wait.
Or
We
you're
can wait till later.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'll hand the mic over to Amanda if you're ready. You can say as much as little as you want, but I appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, so let me first see if I can successfully share my screen, because on no conferencing platform have I been able to successfully share my screen before. But I haven't used Bitsy outside of this, so.
Yeah.
Oops.
There we go.
Yep. Okay, great. I can see stuff.
All right.
That's awesome.
So much easier than Zoom for some reason. Okay. So I'm interested in the question of what the difference between digital and analog means, because as I was reading and researching, I saw the terms used in all kinds of different ways, and in ways that were really unfamiliar to me. So my starting place was well, you have digital clocks and you have analog clocks, and there's kind of an intuitive difference between the way those represent time. Analog, there's this kind of correspondence between time passing and the motion of, the minute hand, whereas digital just displays a number. You can also think of music recordings like an MP3 where the music's been coded and modulated, and then a vinyl record where, similar to an analog clock, the information is stored. See, part of why I was interested in this is I had this kind of intuitive understanding of the difference, but it was hard to put in words. But in a vinyl record, it's the music is stored in the actual shape of the record, right? So I started reading through the Macy conferences, which is what I have open on the right hand of my screen. And these are conferences that went on from 49 to 50 something, and it was really foundational for cybernetics. It was very interdisciplinary, and some of the talks are all over the place, and it's hard to see how they relate to one another. But behind it was this shared idea of kind of what cognitive science is. We can study the mind like we can study computers. Computation is fundamental to the mind. So I had been highlighting in the document, and then I'm glad that I found Obsidian when I did, because a few documents I had a bunch of notes in, it just my notes were stripped. So I started going through my highlights and translating them into Obsidian. So that's what this first bit of notes is. But one of the things I highlighted from the beginning of this collection of presentations, it was in the introduction to the collection of presentations from the conferences. It said that these ideas of analog and digital were really foundational to what cybernetics is. So the common precondition of these foundational concepts discussed is digitality, and because of that, throughout these papers, there's a lot of discussion on the difference between analog and digital. And as I was working through the papers, often the terms were just used to mean continuous and discontinuous, or continuous and discrete, or all or none, and that did not line up with my intuitive, the analog versus digital clock idea. I could see the connection, but I haven't gotten back to this part in my second read through of the conferences. But at one point they were talking about how digitality could come in degrees, and that I cannot tell you what that means. Maybe next week when I finish going through this. So that was kind of the starting place for my asking this question. So I started by taking some quotes from the Macy conferences here that characterized analog and digital as continuous and discontinuous, just like things that hinted at ways of distinguishing the two concepts, linear and nonlinear. Let's see. At one point they were saying that every digital machine is also an analogical machine. So I was just seeing I was seeing these terms used in a variety of ways. Then there's an article shared in the Slack at some point from Van Turen. Let's see if I can easily pull that up. Yeah. All right, we'll switch sides. So I was reading through this that was shared in the Slack, and I saw.
Oh, we lost your screen.
I lost Amanda too.
I don't know what happened.
It's just a cliffhanger.
Yeah, it's really exciting. And
I don't know if Amanda can hear us or not, but it sounds like her connection is not there.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, so until okay, Jesse.
Oh no, I was just trying to like flag Amanda.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that's really interesting. While we take a break here, what did you find interesting about that? The things that she covered.
Well, I saw this yesterday, but you posted it last week. There's a really fitting tweet. You can see my screen.
Yeah, I can see your screen.
There we go. It's the one from Louise, but basically saying, it's 1949, the Library of Congress can't figure out how to classify Norbert Wiener's book Cybernetics. And just you know, just a little bit of like perspective that even now we don't really know how to talk about it. Like what is cybernetics is kind of its own thing, like a proto-systems theory, like multi-scale, multi-domain thing. And this is the fun little, like, it's basically literally the Library of Congress saying, hey, we don't know what to do with this, you know. So, you know, just to kind of, that's a fun thing, but is it Amanda back?
Yeah, I think she's back.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a cliffhanger there. You dropped just as you started the new paper, and we were all integrated.
Yeah, I don't know if I might have overwhelmed my computer, or it's really windy here, and we lost our Wi-Fi last night, so hopefully that's not what's happening.
Oh.
I don't know if you saw, but I was just talking about this, you know, in 1949 there was still a debate about how to even talk about cybernetics, and the Library of Congress wrote to Norbert Wiener saying, how do we classify your book? We don't know what to do about it, so I'll fix with that. But yeah.
Oh yeah, I saw that quote. That was pretty funny. The letter.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense after I was looking through these conferences. It's like interdisciplinary to the point of being maybe like non-disciplinary.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Macy's conferences are super interesting in that sense because it's like how this is the first time a lot of people in like somewhat defined fields had such a. I mean, I'm sure there's been conventions of like that historically, but like they were a very early first melting pot for a lot of things, and it was cool to see. So please continue with your journey.
Thank you. So, so this article was shared in Slack. I thought it was very cool and interesting. And then at one point, they were talking about how a quintessential feature of life is that there's like this digital aspect and an analog aspect. They talk about the separation of phenotype from genotype, so like the, how the information is coded versus how it's expressed. And they described the genotype as a dedicated digital information storage media, and they referred to cells and organisms as the mostly analog processing devices, and that was strange to me. So I guess I got a idea of how genes could be seen as digital in the sense that they, code information, and there's maybe a finite number of there are like digits in a very real sense. Like if you look at DNA, there's like I guess it wouldn't be binary because there's more than two options. But it is there are digits, I guess. But I didn't know how the cells and organisms would then be analog. So I guess that's still an open question for me. But I included that part of this article in my notes. And then the last, I guess I found a few more articles, but the last one that I really dug into and found most helpful and interesting was Meili 2010. So this is what I did last time that cut off my internet. So let's see if I can share the screen, share the article. Am I still here?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, analog and digital versus continuous and discrete. I found this paper very, very helpful. It was published in Philosophical Studies, which is like the best philosophy journal. And this guy talks about, he describes what he calls the received view, which is that analog just means continuous, and digital means discrete. And that is how I would describe much of what was happening in the Macy conferences, at least as far as I have gotten through them. But he uses this, what does he call them? The representational medium versus the representational format. He introduces these terms in order to describe what he thinks is the difference between analog and digital. So he proposes that an analog representation is one where the represented quantity co-varies with the representational medium, regardless of whether the medium is continuous or discrete. So this is where the simple image of an analog clock seemed to make perfect sense. So, or even a vinyl record. So the thing being represented, time, co-varies with the thing representing it, the clock. So as time passes, the second hand moves. There's a strong like isomorphic connection between the two. And that makes sense to me because when you like analog, you think of analogies. And what are analogies? There's like, structural similarity between the two things you're talking about. So I thought Meili's definition captured that pretty well. I forget if it was in this paper or in another I started to look at. So regardless of whether the clock is continuous or discrete, could mean like regardless of whether the second hand moves continuously or ticks, that would still count as an analog clock because of the way that time is represented. Whereas in a digital clock, there's no such structural similarity between the representation and the passage of time. His definition of digital rests on this definition of digits, where the specific place of the digit matters, the base matters, like base 10. And he notes that a digital representation necessarily represents a number. I want to keep thinking about that as it relates to how the Macy conferences were talking about digitality, because that didn't seem to be true the way they were talking about it. But I thought that was interesting. and I want to understand better why that would be the case. I'll go back to Beck, and then I found a few articles, one of which was this one from Mochizuki and Shinomoto that seemed to exemplify what Meili called the received view, where continuous just means, or sorry, analog just means continuous and digital means discrete. And that's the way that these authors talk about it throughout their article. So I want to go back to that paper and see maybe like what limitations result from the way they're talking about it in light of what Meili says. Like, could we get more from their results if we talk about analog versus discrete differently? Have to go back to that. And then Beck 2018 investigates what analog representation here, analog mental representation. He goes into perception, imagery, and numerosity as examples of mental representation, where in the literature those are described as analog. And he just tries to clarify what analog means. He distinguishes between what Meili would call the received view. He calls that the continuous conception of analog versus the mirroring conception of analog, which would include Meili's view, and that's the view that a representation is analog in virtue of being structurally isomorphic to, or otherwise mirroring what it represents. So that I also have to return to this article. But I guess that's pretty much what I have so far. As I was doing the research, I found some of my questions answered, but I found many more questions being generated. So it goes.
Yeah.
I guess I can click around Obsidian a little. So this is where I compiled the notes for this meeting. I just took, the quotes that I wanted to mention, but I guess I didn't do this for the Macy conferences yet because there's a bajillion papers in that collection. But for the others, I linked to, I created notes for the article as a whole, and that's what's linked to. So if I go to that set of notes and I show, the local graph, it shows all the things that I reference. And I thought that was very cool, and it's very simple right now. But like if I reference other articles like within them, you can see like it displays that. So I'm looking forward to making my notes more complicated so that this little figure looks more complicated and can be more helpful.
Did you see the big full graph that they have?
So what is it? Not local graph, but
it may help if you like could minimize the paper or like adjust the screen on the right. But if you go all the way to the left, like right by where it says research on the left tab, and click that thing that has a bunch of nodes. Yeah. This sometimes scares people when it looks like when people see these dots. But like I think it's cool, and it like there's a way like if there's something like if you click somewhere, I forget where it is, but like you can show its development over time, like it maybe being like in like the triple dots or something like that in the upper right triple dot menu or something. But like no, I don't know where it is, but there's like a certain command somewhere where you can see like your evolution over time of how we populated this chart. That's pretty cool. It's all like just visualization stuff. But.
Yeah, and I haven't used tags yet, but that's one way to filter it. So I could like, only look at articles that mention certain things. I don't know what orphans.
It's cool.
Oh, orphans is like I guess empty. Yeah, it would be empty.
Yeah. And it's
cool.
That's cool. Yeah. And there's a whole lot on how to best organize your Obsidian. It's really personal preference. Some people want to have a lot of like folders, like Amanda's using these very nice folders for like citations and terms, which is great. And there's like other structures for having like actual pages of notes that serve as sort of reference points that you link and all sorts of cool stuff. So I'm happy to see people exploring Obsidian. But yeah, not to bury the lead. The lead is like that's awesome. Like I totally, I kind of want to like invite slash not drag you into, but like this fits super duper well with the Embodied Intelligence conference and what I'm actually doing in it, which is like looking at terms. And I know you kind of looked at the Sutton article and like, yeah, this isn't really interesting. It's not. It's but I think that the question of how do we talk about this stuff and how do we talk about digital analog, how do we talk about like for those who don't know, like representational brains and phenotypes is like the foundational banner program under which orthogonal lab came into being. So kind of really exploring the stuff about phenotypes and genotypes. How do we even talk about that? What do those mean? What are like actual things in biology, and what does it mean in terms of like just analog and discrete, and continuous and digital? Like this is all super relevant and super interesting to me. So I could say more, but I'll let if Bradley wants to say in there. Anybody else have any questions too?
I can say a little more. I didn't write them out, so I forgot to say just like some further questions that this raised for me. So there's still, I can still see like the intuitive connection between analog as like Meili defines it and analog as continuous. And I think the concepts could be clarified by looking at like the levels that you're describing at any given moment. So I found his terms of representational medium and representational format interesting and helpful. So he talks about how those things can each be like continuous or discrete, but that doesn't necessarily determine whether the representation is analog or digital. But so I guess I want to think more about where we can say that analog representations like are necessarily continuous or digital. He does say digital representations are necessarily discrete, so I guess I just want to think about that connection more. And then a thing in the background of all of this is that the terms analog and digital are being used to describe representations, and in cognitive science, what is a representation? Well, that's another place where you can find any answer under the sun. So I guess I want to see how well this description of the difference fits with different definitions of representation, or whether you even need to talk about representations in order to talk about these concepts. According to some of these authors, they think that the concepts like necessarily describe representations. Some maybe you could talk about it more abstractly as just how a signal is coded. I guess my next specific task is continuing to go through the Macy conferences and to see how they talk about it and see if I can, sort their comments into these different views that I've found. Because they said some really weird things throughout some of these papers, like that analog and continuous is a spectrum. I don't know what that could mean. That every digital system is also analog. Not quite sure if that would be true, depending on how you define the terms. So that's my next concrete task is continuing through the Macy conferences.
I think that's great. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought as usual. And Jesse put some things in the chat here. So this is Johann John published. I guess this is a category on his blog or something. Great posts on representations, especially from bio.
I can I can share my screen about that.
Yeah.
Ready.
Thank you,
okay. Really quickly,
Amanda, for that.
I'll just show this here. So Johan is one of the people I respect most, probably anywhere, to be honest. But like Johan's approach to really approaching scientific questions from a very grounded point and being very open to skepticism and not being beholden to a dogma is really great. And he has a series. This is just his like. He's written a whole bunch of stuff, a lot of places. He's very well written. But this is one of like his personal site and blog. He recently last year, and this is part of the discussion group that I attend sometimes. They went deep into representations for a while, and he has a series of articles in defense of placeholder representation. Representations means exactly what you think it means. The continued defense of a much maligned placeholder. This was again last year. And then also, yes, symbolic representations occur in the brain, also dragons. And just like this is a little bit cheeky in the wording here, but like if you want to dive into another take on representations from the bio perspective, this is a really cool way to do it. And I always recommend Johan whenever I can, because I find I want to be like them eventually in terms of how they talk about things in articulate ways that offer a little, don't kind of tip the scale too much in one direction. So I think he's really good at that. That's all I want to say about that. But yeah, there's a whole lot of things. I think it's a super interesting concept, as I said before, and even just the whole take on embodiments and embodied intelligence and this sort of agent versus environment versus internal stuff is really a lot of major questions continue to arise from this, and that's kind of why cybernetics is this nebulous multidisciplinary topic across many domains anyway. It's trying to look at those boundaries and what is the functioning mechanisms across different things, whether it's internal states or external like interfaces. So there's just so much, like there's so many things here. I think it's a great dive into it. Were you gonna say something, Bradley?
Oh yeah, well, I wanted to launch into something, so I don't know if you're done.
I mean, this would be a great segue into like talking about Embodied Intelligence Conference, but we can do that later. That doesn't mean we'll be talking about it at some point. So.
Yeah, we'll talk.
You can.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to raise a couple points. So one, I think that's great work. Thank you, Amanda, for sharing your notes. And this is just great work. A lot of questions that are open now, or I think we've kind of dealt with some of these questions in different ways that we've never answered them. So this is like one of those things where you keep asking the same question in different ways, and sometimes you don't get an answer right away. You have to think about it in a different way to get the answer. So like if you're thinking about it in terms of computing, sometimes you don't know you can't figure out what the answer is. Sometimes you think about it in philosophical ways, you can get to the answer. So I want to make people aware of this, that sometimes that's why interdisciplinary work is so powerful, because you can go, when you look at something, and this goes for like philosophy, maybe philosophy doesn't necessarily have the answer, but maybe if we look at it in terms of like, statistics or information theory or something, we can figure it out. Speaking of which, I don't have my board. I couldn't get it up because of some driver issues this morning, but so if I use my hands, maybe that's better. So there's this issue in measurement where, there's this issue in measurement where, the idea of making something quantitative is a matter of like taking something in the world and measuring it. And we think about it, kind of think about it as automatic, or maybe even axiomatic sometimes. Like, we think of a measure of like temperature, or we think of a measure of like a distance. And we kind of don't really think that could be any different. It's just kind of like, this is the measurement, this is the set of relationships. Here are the statistics. And in school, we learn like kind of the easiest statistics or the most common statistics that, or at least at the lower grades, that exist. So, we learn things like, we learn about the normal distribution, okay, and everything that goes along with that. So, you might be excused if you think that this is the way things are. But there are a couple of ways around that, of course. One is that in different cultures, people have different conceptions of these things. So what is maybe continuous in one culture is discrete in another culture, and vice versa. Or the sampling points where people are sampling their reality from some phenomenon, like light or color are different. We talked about color spectra last week. And we talked about how the color spectrum are physical, so there's a physics to it. And your eyes have a physiological response. And in different cultures, people will sometimes, people's physiology doesn't differ that much, but the cultural representation differs quite a bit. So the cultural representation basically pulls out what's important. And so the measurement of, say, like colors, if you take a cultural representation of it versus something like a subtractive or an additive map of the physics of the colors, it's going to be far different. And it's going to look different. And it's going to have maybe some sampling. It's going to be densely sampled in some places and lightly sampled in other places. And this isn't directly related to something we might call as discrete versus continuous, but it does set the boundaries of some of these measurements. Continuous usually means finer grained. Discrete usually means maybe coarser grained. So, there's that aspect of it. Another thing is there's this set of techniques called soft or fuzzy sort of statistics, where instead of using the typical discrete measure, like if you think of a bit, it's a binary measure, it's 0 and 1. You would use a grade. So you would say, how much does this thing belong to this class? Instead of whether it belongs to the class or not. So you'd have like a degree of membership. So you can see that in that case, you have a binary difference between whether something belongs in a category or not versus a degree of membership. And so maybe it's 40% this thing and 60%, or well, it doesn't have to be additive. It could be 40% this thing, 50% something else, 30% yet another category, as opposed to like it's in category A, it's not in category B, and it's in category C. And then of course that's incorrect because we've used different thresholds on them. And so that's another way of thinking about it, or these measurement systems. So, there are a lot of things that there are a lot of things to follow up on here. And I think measurement techniques is one area where it's potentially very powerful to look at some of these differences between continuous and discrete. Sometimes we discretize things for convenience. Our number line is discretized to an extent. In pure mathematics, we have continuous representations of things that in everyday life we use as discrete measurements. So like a discrete measurement would be like something that is, an approximation. It's how many, like, it could be 36 centimeters. It could be a little bit more than 36 centimeters, but we round it down to 36 centimeters. And that's a heuristic that we use. And then we have a concept of that scale. Whereas in number theory, of course, you can have continuous numbers, that don't end. There are different ways that you can do this. So I know I'm going on here, but I wanted to give you some ideas about how this translates into other things beyond philosophy. And then I found that part where you talked about biological organization really interesting. I don't know what paper that was, where they talked about the genome versus the cell, the genome being discrete, the cell being continuous. But that's a common idea, that the genome is sort of, has these discrete states And it's like you have nucleotides, which are discrete states, and then open reading frames or codons, which are discrete states, and so forth. And so that's all in there as a sort of a discrete code. And then that gets translated into something, and in the cell, which is continuous perhaps, or maybe discrete, but it doesn't have that sequence quality to it. So it's different. It's like a, I don't know if it's a dial, but there are a lot of things in the cell that are maybe more continuous than in the genome. So I find that also interesting. I don't have any insights there. Okay, the Van Schuren paper, Towards the Theory of Evolution is Multi-Layer Learning. Yes, or multi-level learning. So that's good. That's a good paper maybe to follow up on too. And there's some other that rabbit hole may be quite deep, because in other areas of there's been a lot of philosophy of science and theoretical biology that's kind of focused on this idea of the genome as a code, or what's going on with regulation. I mean, that's a huge area in biology, and of course people use data to address that, but people also look at the philosophy of it more. And so, I mean, that's a direction you might go. But that's a rabbit hole, I warn you. Especially if you don't know a lot about like biology. Well, you don't have to really know that much about modern biology, but it does get, like, the terms get thrown around a lot. So that's a thing to be aware of. But definitely though, I mean, this is going to be like something, I think you could have like a nice paper on this, but perhaps there are other avenues that we can explore to do research on. Definitely beyond even philosophy. Okay.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all that. And it's actually before even Bradley said what he said, I was going to say, for people who aren't, maybe like, if people aren't familiar with philosophy, or like, a lot of like philosophy-based graduate students or things like that, I think I really appreciate people like Megan K. Peters from UC Irving, Michigan. She's a really interesting person who, I can pull up her website or something. She's a really interesting person who is like philosophy oriented, but does computational neuroscience and cognitive science work. And she's one of the few people, I mean, content recording does too, but like she really openly expresses philosophy as important and central to science. And you find a lot of scientists, we're kind of in the camp of like, of course philosophy, of course interdisciplinary stuff, but there are sort of elements of science and research where they're kind of, well, I only want to focus on what I can immediately study, and I don't want to. There are different degrees of how people integrate philosophy into their work, and I would just say, I think a great thing to do is always know people who really like the philosophical lens, because even if it's not your specialty, they can really help you refine a lot of the finer points and dig into what does this really mean? How do we situate this? And kind of as Bradley was saying, like there's sort of like areas where different explanations or paradigms or views are applicable or not. And in some ways, the best you can do is just be aware of that. When you're like framing, when you're trying to push your assertion, the more you're aware of that, the more you can better represent what that philosophical framework is that you're working in or touching on, or that the narrative, the conversation path, the line of narrative that you're contributing to. The more you're aware of it, then the more you can help people be aware of the bigger picture. And I think that's sort of like that's like the art and the fun part of research that I think is cool. And I think philosophy is like a little bit underrepresented at times in that. So I'm trying to celebrate it when I can, if that makes sense. So anyway. Okay, great. Anything else? Did you want to say anything, Amanda? Did you on camera? Cool.
Oh, I do want to send another quote to the chat from the Missy conferences. When it's like the only time I saw it, they talked about biological development So
Okay.
just throw that.
If one takes the phylogenetic standpoint, starting from unicellular organisms and going upward to the vertebrates. Oh, I don't. Yeah. But the terminology there is a little bit rough, but that's okay. It would seem a very extraordinary thing for the brain to evolve as a purely digital machine. It is likely to be digital on an analogical basis, and I think that where the analogical properties appear to crop out, they're very likely rather primitive. If you want to keep it digital, you must have an intercellular digital setup of the kind that has been suggested. Yeah, and this idea actually in a lot of, I guess, theoretical neuroscience is sort of underpinning a lot of this. So like if you go back to connectionism, if you go back to some of the stuff that McCullough and Pitts did, I mean, they were really physiological, but they did actually, at the core of their work, focus on this question of whether the brain is discrete or whether it's continuous. And it turns out that, synapses are, the action potentials say are discrete, but there are a lot of neurotransmitters that modulate it. So there's this continuous aspect of it as well. And the same goes for gene expression. You have these mechanisms that act in a continuous way that tune things, but you also have this discrete thing that you can measure. And so if you can measure it as a discrete thing, and there are also these continuous factors, that means that there's still this open question. And it's really, people have just used things to make it easy. In science, we do things to make it simple. But sometimes that can get you into trouble because those simple things, sometimes they're not very reliable. They might be a nice way to do it, but you still have problems with what happens in certain. There's a lot of times when you have problems with replication, and the reason is because you have these things that are sort of these switches nominally, but they get regulated in different ways in different contexts. So if you go to some different context, that continuous aspect will make this system unpredictable. So it's kind of something like that where we don't, and this is where philosophy comes in because it makes us aware of those issues. So I think that's very good. Very good quote. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. So for those who don't know, do you want to Bradly, would you say what is the phylogenetic standpoint?
Oh, just where and this is something I guess this quote is from the 1950s, but the idea is that, the phylogenetic standpoint is where you have this tree of life, and that they talk about, there's this old idea of the scala natura, which is where, there are organisms that are sort of lower, and then humans and vertebrates are upper, the idea being that there is an evolutionary path from single cell organisms to us. But the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of cases where you get, it's really the way the proper language is in a phylogeneticist would be basal versus derived, which means that something is not hasn't experienced any evolution versus something that's experienced a lot of evolution, a lot of change. The thing is that it doesn't always mean that things that look the most complex are the most derived. There are bacteria, for example, that are highly derived. Just because they've had a lot of evolution, they just never became anything more than bacteria. And so, it's kind of a term that gets, I don't know. I don't like to use it. I'm not comfortable with the terms like higher and lower in evolution. That's just something that was, I learned, and then, you see something once and you can't unsee it for other reasons. Yeah. Well, anyways, let's move on to some other things. I wanted to get to some things. So this week, I wanted to talk about a couple of things that we have. So first of all, I want to congratulate Ankit Grover. This is our Medium. This is our blog that we have through the lab. And if you go to our Medium front page, looks like this. It's at medium.com URL group. You can put that in the chat, Jesse. And then we have a number. So we have Jesse, myself, and Ankit have authored articles on this blog, and you're welcome to publish an article on it. I think Samantha expressed interest in this, but anyone's welcome to write a post. What you do is you set up your account, and I think we have to give you permission to join our group, and then Jesse and I will review the post and make it go live. So Ankit's post is this post on 5 new ideas for evolutionary optimization. And this is some of the work that we've been working on with evolutionary algorithms and different versions of using those for optimization. So this kind of goes through, we were working on a paper, it's a preprint now available, but these are some of the ideas that were sort of discussed in that paper, maybe some other ideas as well, and he put it into a list of 5 things that you might be interested in learning more about. And so that's a nice review of some concepts that a lot of people may not be familiar with. Ankit's approach to evolutionary programming or evolutionary computation really ties into like machine learning, and so he's interested especially in like how evolutionary strategies can interact with gradient descent to provide better optimization. So it's just a matter of like writing out like an organized post where you have maybe a couple things that you talk about very briefly, have some images to put in, and then have some references at the end. And then that's the whole post. It doesn't need to be a really long thing. Ankit also did a review of the Neuromatch 4 conference. So this was like the things that he found interesting from this online conference. He put in some screenshots. There were some topics here. So these were talks that were, his favorite talks, talked a little bit about what they were about, and just kind of went through quickly. So that's one way to do this. So if you're interested in doing a post like this, I would definitely suggest talking it over a little bit with myself and Jesse about the outline, writing it up, submitting it through the medium, and then we'll publish it. And then you'll be in this list of published work here. I guess this is not, like this is just published online, but it's through the lab, so it's nice. Secondly, I wanted to mention Gsoc. So Gsoc, Google Summer of Code, we did not get accepted as an organization this year. I don't know. I guess it's probably pretty competitive. So this is our first try at being an organization. We didn't get in, but we're still going forward through INCF. So if you're on NeuroStars, that's INCF's discourse server. So all their projects are listed on on NeuroStars. We're number 22. So I have 2 projects from DevoWorm, which is another group, but also from our Ethics Society, Technology and Society group. So that's the collective cognition model for AI ethics, which is actually about open source, but then there's the DevoWorm projects, which is GNN's developmental networks and digital microsphere. And so those are all still active under INCF. The application period starts soon. I know Cheyenne is working on that. And so this is going to be a nice opportunity to maybe get some spots. I don't know. I can't guarantee anyone spots because, the INCF has a certain number of spots. And if we had gotten accepted as an organization, we could have maybe gotten more spots. But, that's the way it goes. So yeah,
You're
we'll
still
be
accepting applications for that, or is that set now?
This is for what? The application
Gsoc.
period for Gsoc is just for students is just opening up. It's not. I don't think it's open yet, but yeah.
Okay. So anyone could apply when the period opens to those things.
Yeah. Once it's open, and I usually recommend that people work out an application. They work out sort of the mechanics of it as early as possible. And I'd be happy to look at proposals if you have a proposal you want me to review. the basic components of a proposal are you have the description of what you want to do, and then in a lot of these projects, I give people the freedom to sort of come up with their own solution. So you have to lay out what that is. And then, if you can provide like maybe a toy model or a mock-up of what you want to do, that's good too. If you can show some results, sometimes when people do machine learning projects, they show just some quick results just to show that it works. And then the schedule, which is important. And this year, the collective cognition model for AI ethics, for example, is at 350 hours. And so what's happened in the past is they've had these 175-hour projects, which usually last like an entire summer, from about May to August. A 350-hour project is probably from about May to October or November. So this is important to keep in mind. This will be a longer period. You'll be able to plan things out. So like for this collective cognition model for AI ethics, which we talked about, you would have it would fall into two parts. You would have the 175 hours of the initial model, which could be the reinforcement learning model or the cybernetic model. And then the second half, the 175 hours, would be the agent-based model. Now, you don't have to divide it up like that because you do need to do some data validation. But the idea would be you'd have basically two parts where you'd focus on one, then maybe the other. I would probably do like 120 hours of the first model, 120 hours of the agent-based model, and then the last part would be training the model and validating. And you can divide that up any way you want. But it's the key to a good project is to have a good, one of the big keys to a good project is to have a good schedule, to make it so that you don't, like if something doesn't work, you don't get stuck. You can do other things and, you have some flexibility in there, but that you show that you're going to move through it rather quickly and that you know what you're doing. So that's the key to a good proposal. And like I said, I'll read through proposals to give you feedback on them. So that's fine. And I look forward to reading some of these proposals because I think I want to see how people approach them. I'm always amazed at how interesting the approaches are from year to year. Just people really have some really interesting ideas. So that's the Gsoc update for this week. Then I wanted to talk about this hard to define events workshop. So about 10 years ago, I came up with this idea, and I have had a couple collaborators who worked on this, that we should do a workshop on something called hard to define events. And it sounds kind of weird. Like, what does that mean? So hard to define events, we've talked about it a little bit today. It's like measurements and computational methods and maybe some philosophy about things that are hard to define. And you'd say, well, that's a lot of science. Well, it is, but people usually don't recognize it as such. So this was a workshop held at Artificial Life 13. So it was a workshop that was like an afternoon session. We had like 4 speakers on different topics, and we had some other people I interviewed for it. And so these are all like, it's interesting, but it maybe deserves some follow-up. And started out like kind of trying to update this page, and then I kind of lost interest in it after about a year, and then 10 years went by. So there's maybe something to revisit here, and people have been interested in this, but it's hard to really kind of get your head around like what it is. But there are a lot of things like highly recursive processes, embedded patterns, and inherent high dimensionality. There are processes that result in rare events that are of large magnitude, so things like rogue waves or large hurricanes or weird-looking organisms. There are processes that result in significant fluctuations within which events of interest are embedded. So, highly chaotic systems or, chemical reactions, things like that have these fluctuations that, we don't usually, our statistical methods are such that they're very normative. They don't really allow us to understand things that are outside of our norm of our experience. They kind of average things down to give a description. But there's a lot going on outside of that average that are interesting. And then there are these social, cognitive, and neuronal processes that are not explicitly causal. So these are diffuse effects or strongly interacting effects. And so I did a number of blog posts that may be relevant here. There were some essays that I pulled in. So these are things this was I think another blog post, but it was relevant to the conference or to the workshop. So there are a number of things we can look at. And one of the things that came out of this, or I think one of the things that have been followed up on from this, is this focus on rare events. So like things that you don't necessarily capture on an average, things that are very far away from like the mean. And when I say that, I mean we usually use a sort of a normal distribution to characterize things. We have a mean and a standard deviation, and then things that fall outside the standard deviation are considered things on the tail of a distribution. And we don't really spend too much time thinking about those. It's just a curiosity. There are some statistical models like power laws where you have a sort of a mean of the distribution, and then you have this long tail, which is where a lot of the events maybe that are not normative happen. So you have these, this tail, and it can be stretched out. And so like a power law would be something like earthquakes, where you have a fault line and you have all these small earthquakes, all these small displacements. And then eventually, and actually quite at random, you get these large earthquakes. So you have things at large scales that happen very rarely. And so those are things like those kind of rare events. They're not things, we have a statistical model, as it turns out, for power laws. We have, we can model noise in the same way. So people have kind of worked out that aspect of it. There's a lot more to explore in the difference between, say, like a normal distribution and a power law, and what makes those things different. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect is in machine learning and in deep learning, they use this concept called out of distribution data. So that means that, like in a training set, you would have a distribution of things that you would observe, and there's, like, of course, this normal distribution of things usually. And then you have these things that you don't necessarily encounter all the time. So if I had pictures of traffic lights, right, and I asked you to identify all traffic lights, if they look like traffic lights or they're close, you can identify them. If they're like a traffic signal from 400 years ago, you might not be able to figure that out because it doesn't look like a modern traffic light, but it is a traffic light in the general sense. So that's what they call an out of distribution thing, or there could be other examples of that. But that's something else people have used, and there are also statistical methods for looking at rare events. So there are all these tools that do exist, but there's so much more, and especially on the philosophical side, to figure out what is it that, we tend to think of our scientific processes and our measures as very easy, well-defined, and we do this on purpose. But there's also this aspect that some things are just hard to define. Some things are, maybe we've defined them in a way that's not particularly useful. So that's where that's going, and I just present that as a heads up to where we might be talking about that over the course of the year, these sorts of topics. And maybe we'll do, a paper or two or an abstract or two that kind of talks about some of these issues. So I just wanted to, I think I put that in the Slack at some point. I don't know if people saw this, but this is something, actually I'd like to move this off of the blog and make it into a better sort of, a better archive, but it is what it is right now. So this was the original schedule, so we had some really interesting talks on different things. Yeah. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is this article from Gary Marcus, and I've seen a lot of talk about this on Twitter this week. A lot of people are upset about it, maybe, understandably, because when you do something, Gary Marcus is, like a fire, I don't know what you call it, a fire starter, maybe. They hit something that's rather contentious. What was that?
Yeah, he's the term gadfly. He's the term gadfly, like an annoying nuisance. And again, like it's he can be annoying, but I think it's a great article to talk about. So you go.
Yeah. So yeah. So this was something. Yeah. This is he's often critiqued a lot of modern machine learning and deep learning. So his article is "Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall. What would it take for artificial intelligence to make real progress?" So he's coming from the perspective that our models are not going to, like, you're never going to get to. There was an article recent vintage, maybe the last month or two, where they said maybe deep learning models have consciousness, and people push back against that pretty hard, because that's something that just saying it is kind of risible. This is sort of the same thing for people who do a lot of deep learning research. So let me start by saying a few things that seem obvious. Geoffrey Hinton, godfather of deep learning and one of the most celebrated scientists of our time, told a leading AI conference in Toronto in 2016, "If you work as a radiologist, you're like the coyote that's already over the edge of the cliff, but hasn't looked down." So what he means by that is that deep learning is so well suited to reading images from MRIs and CT scans that people should stop training radiologists now, and that it's just completely obvious within 5 years deep learning is going to do better. Okay, so that was 6 years ago. So fast forward to 2022, and not a single radiologist has been replaced. Rather, the consensus view nowadays is that machine learning for radiology is harder than it looks, and at least for now, humans and machines complement each other's strengths. So this is like this, I know we've talked about this talk that I've put in the Slack. This is the human-assisted AI talk, where there's this thing about hybrid chess, or, where they use humans and machines to sort of come up with new chess strategies. This is kind of what this is. It's sort of a hybrid type of approach where you have human experts that are doing things that human experts do, and which is hard to define, right? A lot of times with radiology, they just look at an image, and if they've been trained for many years, they know what something is. A deep learning algorithm can't really do it. We don't really know why. It was obvious to people before they tackled the problem that they could solve the problem easily, but apparently not. So there's something in human expertise that we don't really know why, but humans can do better at this. Deep learning is at its best when all we need are rough ready results. I don't know exactly what that means, but so I guess the idea of this article is that this has been a consistent trend in AI, where big names have, said that there's a great revolution coming and our approach is going to take the world by storm, and then it just didn't happen. So, this has happened with deep learning, that a lot of the hype has sort of hit the wall in a way, because the hype has been like deep learning will transform everything in the world. And of course, kind of intuitively that seems like, oh, yeah, of course that was not a great thing to do, or a great thing to say. But this is, this sort of hype cycle that I think we've talked about before, where you have a lot of hype surrounding some new technology, and then over time people can become disillusioned, not because it isn't really workable, but because it didn't fulfill the hype that that originally was set out. And so it becomes useful later on as like with some defined applications, but that hype evaporates. And so that's what's happening with deep learning, is that there's been a lot of hype around it, and that it can, people saying that it can do anything, and then it turns out that it can't, like every other kind of technology that's been hyped. And then eventually we're going to find some good applications.
So can we can go through the article, but I would quickly mention that, just for context, for people who aren't familiar with like AI history and stuff like that, I might quickly share my screen also,
Yeah.
if that's okay.
I
was going to quickly show the Wikipedia page for AI Winters.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because, just so people know, like, right now we're kind of bagging on the hype around deep learning, but it actually wasn't always that way. Like one of the major AI Winters was, Marcus is specifically mentioning Geoffrey Hinton as a major player, and one of not too many decades ago, there was a major player like Marvin Minsky, who like infamous or famous in some ways, depending you want to say it, but like he's coming out of a certain AI winter, but like a major like paradigm shifting and research focused moment was when he published this book Perceptrons in '69, and it was basically, well, connectionism and things that would kind of lead into deep learning, well, those are just kind of a waste of time, or there's a really big downplay on what has eventually become popular. So I won't go too deeply into this, but just to say, like, right now deep learning is at a particular point in the hype cycle, and connectionism and neural networks as use is at a particular point in the hype cycle, but it hasn't always been that way. In earlier times, it was actually much more on the other, like, symbolic camp, where people were thinking, no, let's not explore anything else because this particular take on symbolic reasoning and general problem solvers were like that was going to be what was going to lead us to ultimate super general intelligence, super intelligence, and the beautiful future that's kind of implied with all this stuff. So it's not always just the deep learning people. It's just they happen to be right now if you will, where the money and the power is, the hegemonic view. Everybody, if you don't have deep learning or AI or machine learning in your start proposal or your funding proposal, then you're not going to get funding, kind of a thing. And that's just where it is now, but it hasn't always been that way. So I'll quickly, the only thing I wanted to say, but for people who don't know, like, that, I think it's important context to understand how it's shifted over time.
Yeah, AI is one of those areas where you get these cycles that are like summers and winters, and the summers being where there's a lot of funding, and then the winters being where there's no funding. And this is true, I think, in a number of fields, but in AI, it's rather pronounced because there seems to be always a lot of hype around new developments, and then people get disillusioned rather quickly, and so on and so forth. I will say though that like nowadays, as opposed to maybe 40 years ago, there are a lot more tools for these things. So like,
Yes.
one could, this might, like, there might be a summers and winters, but it may be tempered by the practical, like, applications. So people are building things. They're not on the leading edge of the hype necessarily, but they're able to do things with it. So it actually will, maybe look a little bit different, I think, because people are actually able to use deep learning for things. It's just not like, where everything you do is like, oh my God, it's a great new advance, So yeah, okay. Jesse put in here Megan K. Peters, and then the influence of Minsky on exploration of deep learning and other views. Okay, so yeah, then the other thing about like the summers and winters of AI are that I have a graph on this somewhere, but those summers and winters, those fluctuations in AI research funding, what happened during the AI winters was interesting because it was really corresponds with the development of human-computer interaction and the first human-computer interaction labs. So like in the first AI summer, there was a predominance of AI. That was around the time of the Macy conferences and maybe a bit later. And then there was a AI winter, and then that's when you started to see the first HCI labs form, IBM, Park, and some of these other labs. And then there was another AI summer, and then the next AI winter, and there was some more development in HCI. So it almost seems like maybe there's a correspondence between AI and human-computer interaction. And I don't know what that relationship is. I only saw like kind of a casual reference to it once. But it'd be interesting if people, if there was some follow-up there. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know if it was necessarily a shift in people, because there's different people, doing the work. But definitely, I think maybe there is an idea that, we want to work, we want to develop computing, we want to develop some AI technologies. If those are sort of in disrepute, maybe we can make progress on the interface. The first AI winter was around the time the computer mouse came out and things like that. So, it would be interesting to see if there's like what the connection is there. It's a little bit deeper than just what I mentioned here, but
Yeah, and I feel a little bad. I don't mean to take away from the Marcus article, because there's a lot of really interesting things in it, particularly in terms of like his comments on GTP3, his comments on what OpenAI has been trying to do to make GTP3 better and what it can't do, and like the implications for a lot of language and other things. He also mentions like Timothy Jabrew's Stochastic Parrots paper, which is essentially kind of the paper that got her fired from Google, sort of, but it was more like she was basically saying, what are the limitations of, are we just regurgitating stuff in a confused way? And that's a whole there's a whole like drama series about, this paper was kind of meant to be they even used like fake names in the paper, so I wasn't trying to make too much connection to Google, but like Google didn't like it anyway, and this implications about the review process, and like there's just a lot of things that I really encourage a reading of the article fully. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about it now, or turn about other stuff, because we're already late in the day, but I think it's a great article to get up to speed about a lot of the contemporary issues in the field, as I've said.
yeah. So this article, just go back to the Marcus article for a couple more minutes. He talks a lot more about like some of the stuff going on with self-driving cars, photo tagging, so identifying photos, and some of these things about how some results are unreliable. So, GPT-3 is trying to model language, and they're huge models and they're improving, but they still make these mistakes that are, not something that you would expect out of a human. Or, people talk about the singularity, where they say that the singularity is where AI will merge with human consciousness. And so that's obviously not going to happen with GPT-3 or with deep learning, but, there are people who advance that idea. And so I think there's this group, like, Gary Marcus, Ernie Davis, some other people are really trying to be skeptical about some of the things that are happening in the field, because there's a lot of hype going in the other direction, pushing, the GPT-3 will take over the world sort of thing. It's definitely a different view on that. Yeah, so they're different, sometimes some of the things are just kind of like, just being a contrarian, but there are a lot of debates to be had here. If someone wants to pick up on one of these debates, that would be interesting too. In 2020, Jared Kaplan and his collaborators at OpenAI suggested that there were a set of scaling laws for neural network models of language. They found that the more data they fed into their neural networks, the better those networks performed. The implication was that we could do better and better if if we gather more data and apply deep learning at increasingly large scales. And we talked about this with like the split between like the the symbolic representations and sort of the representation-free models. And Peter Norvig, I think, was the person who really first championed this idea that you just take data and you shove it into a model, and if you just shove enough data into the model, it'll overcome any of its shortcomings. And of course, that's probably not going to be the case. There's going to be this sort of relationship between, symbolic models and, like, I don't know if we call them structural models or data-driven models, where they have to be put in some sort of, they have to be combined. But, this is the idea. This kind of goes back to the idea of Moore's Law. So Moore's Law is this idea that people would put on PowerPoint slides like 20 years ago for everything. Like, it originally was about, like, if we take a transistor and we shrink the size and we get more computing power, eventually we're going to have, like, infinite computing power and infinitely small chips. But then you can only make a chip a certain feature size before you start running into quantum effects. So that was kind of hitting the wall of Moore's Law. But there was a scaling that people were fascinated by. And so you would see Moore's Law slides pop up in every presentation on technology. It got a little ridiculous. So, you get this sort of same type of thing with, like, deep learning, where people are, attracted to things like scaling laws. And so there's this sort of skepticism about that. So, I mean, this goes through a lot of stuff. I don't want to spend the entire rest of the meeting on it. But it basically just points out that there are a lot of things that we don't know about yet, and we shouldn't abandon symbol manipulation and the like. So, yeah, I think I put it in the Slack somewhere. It's in a number of channels, so I would check that out. So I want to turn now to our submissions document for 2022. And we have a number of things that we need to follow up on here. So the Gecko submission, this was the one that Ankit and I submitted. Those reviews are coming back sometime this month. So I don't know, Ankit, if you're watching, I guess it's next week or the week after. So we'll talk about that when those come out. We'll see how that goes. Maybe we'll get accepted, maybe not. If we don't get accepted, I like the paper. We have a preprint. We can, apply somewhere else. We can submit it somewhere else, or develop it further and maybe publish it somewhere. The A-Life papers are done. So those have been submitted. So I'll put a green mark on those. This is kind of a rudimentary list because we have our other methods for tracking this stuff. But I like this because I can bring it up in the meeting and add things to it very quickly. But anyways, so the A-Life submissions are submitted. We'll see if we get in. This is the New York Celebration of Women in Computing. So we're working on this right now. This is the survey with Jesse, and I think we haven't submitted that yet. We need to work on that. Correct, Jesse?
I mean, we are accepted, so it's happening.
Yeah.
It's we're basically fleshing out the different points. I think, is that Erin on the phone?
Maybe.
It is, yeah. I'm not quite halfway through prepping my small section of the NYWIC presentation, but I've been in close talks with Jesse on.
So yeah, and that's cool. So like we're like, that's in motion. Like it's basically going to be. I don't think I can quickly pull up. Maybe I can. My notes on it, but basically what we have is we have a good amount of time. We have, like, I think like around a 40-minute chunk of time that's been given to us. So we have a lot of things we can do with the time. And Erin's going to be having a kind of a flash talk, a shorter, like 5, 7, maybe a little more, that area of stuff. I know she's a lot of material, so we're sorting that. And then there's also, like, Angela's data trust stuff she's going to be doing. And I know Brian mentioned some interest in some like things for AI, some of the technical matters for AI ethics and interpretation and neurosymbolic stuff too. So those are sort of like 3 things we're looking at, and it's kind of just like fleshing out what this program is going to be. I know there's something. I think Bradley's also going to do an overview of like our Google Summer of Code stuff or other things, or what does he want to do?
I think I prepared like 3 slides and I put them in the Slack somewhere. Did you get those slides, or I just linked to them in there?
I don't think I saw the slides yet.
Okay,
but
I think I direct messaged you or something. Yeah.
Okay, so like suffice to say, like there's like definitely opportunity if people have an idea they want to flesh out. To have like if you want to have like a small flash talk about something of your own in the general things that we've been talking about, and really with anything in terms of AI and ethics broadly, but specifically we have topics along the lines of like just what's going on, like with Tim Jabru and her, like her whole story really is something that I probably will just mention again. Last year we mentioned that that's kind of a main narrative, seeing how she left Google and what happened with the paper and what happened with other researchers and how it's affecting a lot of the landscape and what do you do like as a potential whistleblower in a tech community. So like we'll probably touch upon that too, and any of those different things you could present on, but also just as a general update, like that is in motion and that is happening, and I'm talking to all the different like subcomponents about it, and yeah, like that's the event itself is basically in a month. It starts the 8th and 9th, so we're trying to finish up some things before then, and it kind of got superseded because there's another event that I just found out that was actually I got into. We'll talk about that next probably, but the New York Celebration of Mini Computing stuff is in motion, and if you have any questions, check out the ethics channel in the Slack or just message me. So yeah, that's happening.
So it's in Notion or in motion?
It's in motion.
Okay.
Like it's not.
Yeah, no,
there's nothing.
We have a thing called Notion, which is it's a platform, and then Motion. Yeah, so it's. Anyways, so yeah, actually, this 8 or this next one, yeah, it should be the EI Workshop, and this is 2022. So this is the Embodied Intelligence Workshop, and I don't think we had it on here. Oh no, we do have it here. Okay. So number 12, so I don't need this. So let's see. We have the WeRobot, which is the next one. That's the one that Jesse, we met about this week, and you sent me 2 sample abstracts.
Yeah. My my personal update for this week, which I'm not going to really go into now, doesn't matter. Well, like this is the week for me where it was like everything for me, because I'm not in a major graduate, like I'm not like in courses right now. This is the week for me that everything was like boom, like the switch is flipped, everything's real, things are happening, all sorts of stuff is due. By the way, stuff that you didn't know happening is also going to be due. It's like I'm totally engaged now in scholarly life again, because the winter kind of is like this doldrum where it's like, all right, well, and now it's like boom. So WeRobot was actually due last week, and I asked for an extension, and I got it, so that's good. And I was on the fence about 2 different topics, and one of them, I don't know if I can. I think. Let me see if I can share them here. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do it though. I'll show you the glories of Easy Chair, which is like submitting the Easy Chair is kind of a I'll just actually why don't we just I'll do a demo, so when you apply to conferences and stuff you can kind of see demo by share my screen for like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
You can see that, I think?
Yes.
So Easy Chair is like
not easy.
Something like conference submission materials is like typically always awkward. Easy Chair actually isn't that bad compared to some other stuff I've done, but just so you can kind of see like where I'm at. This actually might not. But like this is for WeRobot. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. I don't think this is going to show me what I want to actually see. This is kind of unfortunately proving my point of that it's not really that easy to navigate.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to show like my
Your submission?
There we go. My
There you go.
submissions.
Yeah.
So here's a couple that we have submitted. I put together these. I was originally only going to do one, and it kind of kept merging, and then it's kind of developed into two different things. So the
Okay.
first one, is basically this, and it basically has to do with cognitive interfaces for natural and artificial agents, and how the theme of WeRobot is basically robot is really standing for AI, and it's trying to be very inclusive and very very open to even the call for hearings explicitly states being thoroughly interdisciplinary, even in the bold here. So it's very much a conference that's trying to look at things in a holistic sense, and I really like that. And that's why I bothered to ask for an extension. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to shoot my shot on these things. I feel pretty good about. It's almost tough because I feel like both of these submissions are actually really good in different ways. This one is just basically combining VR with a lot of our work on things I mentioned about effective computing, embodied intelligence development, cognitive offloading. They all come into play here. And basically, this is going to be, if we get accepted for this, it's going to merge a lot of my own interest in VR and AR and augmented reality. And how do we kind of, what's kind of challenges and opportunities in this space of how can we create and share some representations of different like cognitive states or comprehension, what it's like to have certain affordances in a virtual reality simulated sense, and how that can affect things. Like in another group I'm working with, as the saying goes, I'm going to be taking a deep dive, and I'm actually ordering some VR equipment myself, and looking at some things for like people with disabilities and how virtual reality can potentially help them, or also transfer some of their experience to other people who don't have disabilities. So that's definitely an angle that we'll be looking into on this project. And this is something. This is kind of the first riff on a direction I've been seriously wanting to go in for a long time. So if we get accepted for this, I'll be spending a lot of time over the summer on this particular project. And if we don't, I'll still be following up on this later, because it's sort of like if we get this conference is in September, so there's a long time to flesh out things between now and then. And the other one, just to quickly show it, I can't really show this. This? No, this isn't going to be
View.
it.
Oh, yeah, it won't show.
That's a little weird.
Yeah.
Oh, here, this might do it. So this was this is really a brainchild of very interesting conversations I've been having with a number of people who don't always attend the meetings. Jenny in particular, Avery, and also Erin actually contributed a little bit to this and helped me write some of the wording for this, which I appreciate. And it's basically this one is very, I use the keyword digital humanities, and I think it's sort of a project that's designed to look at some things that it's mildly inspired by Jenny's work on plot twisters and journey building, and kind of dealing with how to address some of personal experience in a world where there's a lot of external pressures and forces at play, and there's some different communities or like case studies we're looking at in terms of like digital communities, some of the enhanced assistance like the Meta AI. The Meta AI presentation last week, or a couple weeks ago, really focused on how they're trying to enhance using AR glasses and AR as a it's like assisted representation to have their AI personal assistants be more lifelike and be able to have better cognitive ability and also interpret visually what's happening that you're looking at. So things like that, and also other interactive agents, and how all this kind of meshes together. It's very, I would say, experimental or like avant-garde, or I don't know. It's a very artistic feeling, but I think it's also, if this is also something that will probably there will also be work continued in this area, even if it's kind of in partnership with maybe Jenny and Avery and some of the work going on in that collaboration space. So if you're interested in this, let me know. But for the time being, this is a kind of a potentially, there will definitely be work in this area, but it's a little bit unclear where. It's indeterminate what the next step is, but this is definitely an ongoing conversation being had. It really builds off of our neuromatch presentation, which is also Jenny, myself, and Avery spearheading that too. So yeah, that's kind of what's up with that one.
Well, yeah, we talked about shared representations as sort of a common theme, and we did that paper. It was a year ago now or more. Was it unsuccessful submission? But it's
Can you link that to me again? Because I forgot.
Yeah, I'll send it out. Yeah, it's I'll get the link. I have to go find it, but yeah, that's like some of the early work. We've just been kind of working on this idea, and this is in agents, but this is of course in like humans, and so there are a lot of shared representations are basically where you have a population of agents or people, and they're looking at things and they're sharing a common representation. So like, if you go to an art museum and you survey all the people who walk by a certain piece of art and you ask them like, what do you think this is about? You get a lot of different answers, right? Sometimes you get the same answer. That could be a shared representation. Sometimes though, you go to the grocery store and someone walks by down the aisle and they look at like an ad for something, and you might ask them, what do you think that ad represents? And you get maybe a tighter grouping of answers. So, that there are a lot of things where we share. It's kind of what they call intersubjectivity, where you share this representation, you share references, you're in on the joke. And then that's something that is powerful, I think, for robotics, because you can then coordinate behavior and synchronize meaning and things like that. So I like this idea of shared representations, and I think that'll be a good area to work on. Kind of like
It's also something that like another very quick plug share. It's something it's something that Gary Marcus mentioned as like vital to AGI and moving AI forward is shared representation in a technical sense too. So that's cool. I did want to mention the Embodied Intelligence Conference too. I think we already did that, but like.
Yeah, we're going to go to it next, but go ahead. Yeah.
I'll just show this. So this is happening, and the program's kind of happening and out. I don't think this is a very useful image right now. I just saw that. But this is happening in like
2 weeks,
10 days or so.
Yeah, 10 days.
Yeah. So finishing up this right now, I am. This is going to be the next most immediate thing for me to focus on, and I'm working on this actually with also Jenny, and a little bit Avery, and I really would love to steal some things from Amanda's talk today and kind of have a little segment about analog and digital and analogies in general, but that's to be determined. But yeah, Okay, this isn't like finishing it, but
Yeah.
basically, I'm furthering a lot of my taxonomy work about agents and does this say here? Oh, sorry. This is work on basically. Jenny is specifically working on using David Bates's work. She's really interested in his work, and he's a lot of interesting discussion about kind of the classic embodiment question. And we're looking specifically at a paper about. She's looking specifically at a paper about creating insight, Gestalt theory, and early computer, and looking at things from like John von Neumann, different different behaviors and things like this. So we'll be using kind of maybe what Bates takes on things and some of his as a means to look at some historical stuff. We may be looking at the analogy stuff, and I'll be following up on the Sutton paper and kind of saying, yeah, this is a nice idea, but what are some potential ones we can use to further the idea of a more coherent, more generalized model of the what was it called, the like the quest for basically creating more literacy and more better terminology across different fields of study to look at these questions. So that's happening, and also Bradly has a paper too, or we have a paper, I guess, on
It's
developmental offloading.
yeah. So it's Angela, myself, and Jesse, and it's the developmental origins of offloading. Offloading being this phenomena where you're doing things, you're behaving cognitively, and you're storing things in your brain as a memory. You're paying attention to things, but then there are things that you put in the environment. So it could be like encoding things in like like a totem pole where you have your family lineage, or you have like different symbols in the environment, like stop signs. There are things that you don't want to have to remember. You want to put it in the environment. You want to use it as a shared resource. There are different ways to do this, and this talk is a lot more technical than just like the analogies. It kind of goes into some of the things we can do with agents and offloading and development of agents. And this was something we presented at the Cognitive Offloading Workshop last year. And so that was something that it was like a 15-minute thing. So now it's like 10 minutes. And I'm in the process of changing out some slides, putting in some new slides just to update it. And it'll be good.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I think that actually I really want to dive into that again, especially after the New York Celebration of Computing stuff, because I think offloading. I would like my later half of the year to kind of focus on offloading VR, the VR interfacing project. It's kind of the next level evolution of my toggling, the toggling thing that I started with a long time ago, about toggling different layers of like cognitive ability. So I think as an implementation, that'll be a cool thing to do.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah.
Any other
submissions? Go ahead. Oh, you had one more thing to say?
I was just saying, was there anything else on the submission list that we wanted to
well, not right now. I want to move on to the last thing. I just wanted to talk about one paper today, and then we'll end the meeting. So, again, we're going back to Fermat's library, and we have a number of different papers here we could talk about. Let's see. Maybe we'll talk about this one. How organisms come to know the world, fundamental limits in artificial general intelligence. So this is Johannes Jagger, who's a developmental biologist. I think Jesse was turned on to his work at some point. Stu Kaufman, who's a complexity theorist, pretty well known, and Andrea Rowley.
Is Jagger the guy that was the one who kind of almost like anti-academia and wanted to focus on his principles and stuff.
Yeah, he's like very philosophically oriented. He does a lot of stuff with so he's an interesting guy. This paper is really kind of interesting. It touches on a lot of the themes that we've talked about. So the abstract reads, artificial intelligence has made tremendous advances since its inception about 70 years ago. Self-driving cars, programs beating experts at complex games, and smart robots that are capable of assisting people are just some of the more successful examples. This kind of progress might entice us to envision a society populated by autonomous robots capable of performing the same tasks humans do in the near future. This prospect seems limited only by the power and complexity of current computational devices, which is improving fast. So we just talked about this with respect to deep learning and respect to like AI summers. However, there are several significant obstacles on this path. General intelligence involves situational reasoning, taking perspectives, choosing goals, and an ability to deal with ambiguous information. We observe that all of these characteristics are connected to the ability of identifying and exploiting new affordances. So this is the theme in embodiment called affordances, and they define affordances as opportunities or impediments on the path of an agent to achieve its goals. So they kind of use a little bit different, well, there are a number of different definitions of affordances apparently. One of these definitions, of course, is that it makes your path through the world easier. So a door handle will make it easier to open a door. It's an affordance. Or, a pathway through the woods makes it easier to travel. That's another affordance. And so in this case, they're kind of also saying it could be an impediment, apparently. So, but this is this agent on a path to achieving its goal. It's facilitating it or maybe impeding it. A general example of an affordance is the use of an object in the hands of an agent. So it's like a tool or like a door handle. We show that it is impossible to predefine a list of such uses. So they're saying that, you don't know in advance what's an affordance. It might be used by the agent in different ways. A door handle might be a made door handle, or it could be like something that looks like a door handle that the agent just starts manipulating. So you don't know in advance what affordances actually are. They can be transformed by the agent just through interacting with the environment. Therefore, they cannot be treated algorithmically. So you can't write an algorithm that says this is an affordance, this is an affordance. This means that AI agents and organisms differ in their ability to leverage new affordances. So AI agents and organisms are, going to be able to do this more organically, or I guess the correct terminology is sort of an action where you're interacting with the environment and building things, or constructivist type thing. Whereas AI agents struggle with this. I mean, I guess there are people who study this, but it's not something that their argument is only organisms can do this. This
Can
implies.
you put the link in the chat?
Oh yeah. I'll put it in the Slack because I have this. I'll put it in the Slack. We argue that organismic agency is strictly required for truly open-ended evolution through radical emergence. So this is just kind of the idea of organismic agency leading to this open-ended evolution where there's no goal and where you have these different paths that emerge through just kind of this interaction. We discuss the diverse ramifications of this argument, not only in AI research and evolution, but also for the philosophy of science. So this is a very artificial life type paper, focuses on a lot of embodiment issues, and they kind of go back into the history of, AI here. Since the founding of the Dartmouth Summer Research Project in 1956, this is McCarthy, the field of AI has attained many impressive achievements. They go back to some of these historical aspects. They have them nice references here, path planning, algorithmic innovation, and some of the other things in machine learning. And they're kind of talking, it's very much like the Gary Marcus paper in the sense that they're setting up this idea that AI can't do everything. It can only do certain things, and you have to be recognize those limitations. So this quest for artificial general intelligence, they're being very skeptical of this, and they're kind of laying out why they should be skeptical of it. So this is something that's actually published on, I think, SciArchive right now. I don't know if they're going to publish it in a journal, but I'll provide the link in the Slack. Yeah, it just kind of like goes through some of the stuff about, you know, how we use affordances and things like that, and how we interact with those things, and kind of defining what an algorithm is and how it differs from what we actually need to look at in terms of some of these interactions. So I think that's enough for today on that paper, but I think that's something we should follow up on as well if people are interested. I know Jesse seems pretty interested in it.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if it was my connection. I couldn't really read the papers. So.
Yeah, we could.
Oh, I think there's also, it's published, if I have the right one, is the title How Organisms Come to Know the World's Fundamental Limits on Artificial GI.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, that's the title.
It's on Frontiers, frontiersin.org. You can read it.
Okay, a Frontiers paper. Okay, well,
Yeah.
So it's, Brian put the link in the chat. Thank you. I did, but so that's an interesting perspective. I think definitely it follows up on some of the stuff that Marcus was talking about, and again, you know, it's one of those things that people get upset about because it's like if you're working in deep learning and someone says deep learning is not enough, you get kind of defensive about it, but it's something that is an issue. So
it's also like honestly a really strange thing for me to navigate as I want to do like a PhD in computer science and I'm applying to graduate school. It's like, how do I like, you know, like, yeah, I want to do research, but then like, well, you better like, you know, do this stuff. I was like, oh, so anyway, yeah, that's great.
Or there's also a silver lining to it. Like knowing the limitations allows us to do a better job of actually tackling it. So even if we do say there are fundamental limits, those limits themselves could, if they're true limits, could help us to, you know, actually bring us into reality. So it's not all bad news.
Yeah.
No, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Anyone else have any comments, or either on the paper or in general?
I'm not sure why this is a burning comment for me, but the most exciting thing to me about this paper is that it's the first AI paper that I've seen that references Alfred North Whitehead, and for me that's very exciting.
Yeah.
It references who? I couldn't quite hear you, Brian.
Oh, sorry. Whitehead? You know, Alfred North Whitehead. He has this great... Yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Yeah, so that's great.
Do you want to say more about why you like the reference, Brian? Because people don't know him.
Oh, just because I think that, and Amanda, you probably have that more cohesive, articulate thoughts on this than I do. But for me, reading Process and Reality and some of Whitehead's other later works is really exciting in terms of their applications to AI and computer science in general. And I think that's a field that hasn't really been explored too much to my knowledge. But then again, maybe I'll find out I'm wrong.
I'm actually in a Whitehead reading group right now, and we're working through Process and Reality. And we read a book from Mesla. I can maybe link it here. It was a very nice explanation of him, and it made it, it made the importance of his work very clear.
That's awesome.
Yeah, put it here or in Slack too.
I found this this is what made my Whitehead thing take off. I don't know if this is reversed. It is for me, but it's by Donald Sherburne, and it's a key to Whitehead's Process and Reality. And it's a lot of fun just going through it and kind of trying to explain in more concrete details what he said. It's great.
Yeah. It's great.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for meeting this week. We can follow up on things in the Slack. I hope to, again, don't forget to work on your weekly reports, the little bot that pops up. It's just, what you've done the past week, what your challenges are, and then we'll discuss them more in the meeting. And then if you have things during the week you want to have us review, send us a direct message or something like that. And look forward to next week. Great.
Yeah, I think that was a pretty kick-ass meeting, honestly. So
Yeah.
good to hear from everybody, and good luck and stay in touch, and